Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and AP English and the Harvard Classics. We now turn to Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. This is lecture number 82 in the Harvard Classics lecture series. If you haven't been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, you can go there and find that. But we're also in AP English because we are now introducing ourselves to the study of the Faust motif. And of course, ultimately, our study of Goethe's Faust, which will be for us one of the really cardinal texts of 303. I want to begin with a story in 303 that I've told a number of times to you guys, but I feel like we have to remember it every once in a while. It was just a few months after the tragedy of 9/11 that our top math student at Worland High School and one of my top students as well in 303 came to me and said, I have to ask you a legitimate question. I'm considering what I'm going to major in college, and I got to be honest, Mr. McGee, I mean, I've been following your lectures, and I appreciate, some of the stuff that we're saying. It was very early in our senior year together, and she asked me the question, what is the point of these stories, all these silly stories? I mean, I'm a hard-headed science type. I mean, I'm going to go to the university and I think I'm going to major in, physics or engineering or, mathematics, something, I don't want to offend you, Mr. McGee, but something useful, you know what I'm saying? As opposed to these, these stories, the humanities. Can you give me a reason? I just need a good reason why I'm devoting so much of my time, energy, and AP English to these stories. And I said, listen, here's the deal. We had a tragedy just recently, and here's the thing that's beautiful about math and science. It can tell us everything we want to know about why when airplanes fly into buildings, they fall, and a whole lot of people die. Your math and your science can give us that data in amazing ways. But what your math and science will never be able to tell us is whether flying airplanes into buildings and killing a lot of people is right or wrong. Your math is never going to be able to tell us how we live with a tragedy like that and all the other tragedies of our life, the theodicy question, as we often refer to it. The existence of some really bad things that happen in our life. And how do you deal with that? I mean, how do you get on with that? For that we need stories. And this is what we mean when we say, it's no throwaway term, that fundamentally we are the stories that we tell. More importantly, the stories we retell. I mean, think about this. This story of shaking hands with the devil, making a deal with the devil, this is a really, really old story. I mean, in the history of stories, it goes way, way back in time. Of course, this is the Adam and Eve story with the serpent in the serpent in the Garden of Eden. This is the choice that Cain will make in killing his brother Abel. Of course, when we hit Milton and Paradise Lost recently, we were studying the same thing all over again. So these stories are really important for us as we retell them. And of course, not only as we retell them, but whether we decide to accept them or to reject them, that is, as well, it seems to me, is hypercritical. I think too often we forget this simple little truth as we begin our study of Faust. I want to remind it. And at the beginning of our Faust study, we will start with Marlowe. Now, he didn't invent the Faust story. There's a real debate about who kind of invented this story, and so we really don't know. So we just kind of say Marlowe was the first to kind of give it its English instantiation on stage. And then, of course, the most significant storyline is Goethe's, the great German writer's, his Faust, which is really the reason that we're studying Marlowe, just to get us ready for maybe the greatest of all the writers that we study in AP. I know you guys are smiling because I say that repeatedly, but certainly Goethe is one of the greatest of them all, no question about it. But think about your dates. I mean, Marlowe, we're not going to spend a lot of time with biography, but Marlowe will write this text of Dr. Faustus sometime between 1589 and 1592. I mean, think about that. Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492. 100 years later, you have Dr. Faustus. I mean, just think about that. If you want to think about sailing to the New World as shaking hands with the devil and all of the implications of what it means that Columbus, quote-unquote, discovers the New World. We know about the good and the bad of modernity, don't we? We've spoken about it many times in 303. Think about those dates as it relates to 1592. 8 years later, you have Shakespeare's Hamlet performed on stage, and of course 1667, just a few years later, you have Milton's great Paradise Lost, which we've already spoken about. The assumptions obviously are that as you're joining our conversation, you've been with us for those prior conversations. If you haven't, then I do recommend that you do a little bit of study on learnstrong.net to kind of bring you up to speed. Of course, the Faustian storyline is much older than Marlowe, no question. We mentioned, for example, the serpent in the Genesis 3 account. Of course, Milton's Paradise Lost, and we talked a lot about that Genesis 3 story in our preparations for Milton in the study of Paradise Lost. And so we're gonna kind of skip over some of those points. My assumptions is that you guys can remember that. Think about the devil and the temptation of Christ in Matthew 4 in the New Testament. Think about the exchange of the wager between the devil and God in the book of Job in the Hebrew Old Testament. And of course, no question, we're going to see this wager get played out again as we start our study of Goethe's rendition of Faust. But before we get to Goethe, I want you to have some sense of Marlowe's version, because I think it's significant. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether Goethe actually knew Marlowe's version or not. Some have argued that Goethe didn't actually stumble onto Marlowe's version as Marlowe's version until much later in his life, which is kind of an interesting notion. We do have some assumptions, as we always will share them at the beginning of any conversation that we have, just to refocus and remind us our assumptions. Our learning theory is the attempt to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. That last part is always significant. We're not just here to know what happens in Dr. Faustus, or for that matter, Goethe's Faust. We're here to gain something that we can actually use, because we are creatures who love tools, and literature of language and stories are obviously tools for us. We also assume that we understand our three levels of reading. That's how we learn, that connecting of new information to old information as we read. At level 1, we answer the question, what does the text say? Summary. At level 2, we answer the question, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. We're going to see a number in this text. And then finally at 2B, rhetoric. Not what Marlowe says, but how Marlowe says it. Not what Goethe says, but how Goethe says it. And to that degree, we'll concentrate, as we did with our study of Shakespeare and Milton, on symbolism and irony. We're going to see a whole lot of that in this text. Finally, at level 3, we'll ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? First of all, 3A, relating it to other titles that we've already studied in AP. And by this point in our AP curriculum, we have met a lot of titles and a lot of stories, so we're going to be able to play some interesting games. And then finally at 3B, and most importantly, how can I relate to this information personally? Again, learnstrong.net is our final assumption, and the fact that you've been following, especially our Paradise Lost and Milton lectures. I've saved Marlowe. Of course, we saw Marlowe and the poem To His Coy Mistress already, so we've been introduced to Marlowe as a writer. But I saved this version of the Faust story until now because it prepares us for our study of Goethe. So, for example, we're going to ask about a title that's written roughly, let's use round date, 1600. 200 years later, at 1800, we'll have Goethe's Faust, and part 1, part 2. And there, 200 years later, we're going to call that a romantic rendition of the Faustian story. And we're going to ask some questions at the end of our study, like what's the difference? We'll have something to say even at the end of this study here. Let's work through the storyline quickly, and I'm only going to reference the text just a little bit, but enough to give us a sense of it at least. Dr. Faustus. Well, let's say at least 3 things about him. 1, he is a doctor, he's a scholar, he's incredibly respected, he's German. But he always, in the Faust stories, he always is dissatisfied. Dissatisfied with what? Well, with limits. The traditional forms of knowledge, logic, medicine, law, and theology, religion. So he decides it's time for him to pick up something else. He's going to study magic. The opening lines, when we see Dr. Faustus in scene 1 for the first time, he says it something like this. He says, settle my studies, Faustus, and begin to sound the depth of that thou wilt profess. Having commenced, be a divine in show, yet level and at the end of every art, and live and die in Aristotle's works. Sweet analytics, 'tis thou hast ravished me, ruined me, in other words. A little bit later, is to dispute well logic's chiefest end. Affords this art no greater miracle than read no more, thou hast attained the end. By the way, when we studied our Marcus Aurelius Meditations in the section 5, you'll remember that he said something similar. Stop reading so much books, put them down and go to work actually living the life of a legitimate, honest, and good person. You'll remember Aurelius said that to himself. Also, remember when we did our Don Quixote, Cervantes' Don Quixote? Remember we pointed out the irony that Quixote himself is ruined, the man from La Mancha, is ruined by all of his reading, especially of the codes, the chivalric stories and the codes of knighthood and all of that, and it drives him mad and drives him insane. We're going to have a similar kind of idea being played here. So he's ready to go into the dark arts, into the practice of the magics. And his friends, Valdez and Cornelius, will in fact help him to instruct him in the black arts. And he begins as a magician, as this career as a magician, by summoning up Mephistopheles, the devil, Lucifer. You go back to our comments in Milton's Paradise Lost, and the ways in which people make assumptions, for example, about biblical text, assuming there's going to be a whole lot in the text about the devil and Lucifer and all of that. They're really stunned when they pick up the Bible and actually read it to discover that there's very, very little at all there. We have no real evidence from the Bible itself that Lucifer was coexistent with something like Jesus Christ in heaven and was thrown out of heaven and fell into hell and all. Those stories are what we call extra-biblical stories. And yet here we're going to play the game again with Mephistopheles. Now, Mephistopheles is the devil as well of Goethe's Faust, and so we're going to pay attention to him. Interestingly, in Marlowe's rendition, right away, he's going to warn Faust. You better be careful about the horrors of hell. Faust tells the devil to return to his master Lucifer with an offer of Faustus' soul in exchange for 24 years of service from Mephistopheles. In other words, Faust is ready, Dr. Faustus is ready to sell his soul to the devil for 24 years of whatever he wants. It's an interesting idea. We can pause for a moment and think about what that idea really does constitute, what it symbolizes, what it represents, the notion of complete and total license and liberty. Go back to our comments on Plato's Republic, and this is what Plato, you'll remember, said was so wrong with democracy. It's this unlicensed freedom to do whatever it is that we want. That's what Faustus wants. Wagner, Faustus' servant, now has picked up some magical ability as well, and he uses it to press a clown named Robin into his service. Mephistopheles will return to Faustus with word that Lucifer says, fine. Faust will then experience the first of a number of misgivings, not certain of whether this is a good idea or not. Should he in fact repent and save his soul? In the end, though, he agrees to the deal and he signs it with blood. As soon as he does this, the words in Latin for "O man, fly" appear branded on his arm. Faustus again will have these kind of, I'm not sure about this as being a good idea. Mephistopheles, however, will give him a bunch of gifts, and as well a book of spells from which to learn. Notice that this is a book about, a play about learning, right? About what you should be learning. We go back to our study of St. Augustine's Confessions and how you read a book. Now, we'll say this about Goethe's Faust especially. So much there about how to read a book is contained within that great poem. We're already seeing some of the early evidences of this as well. Okay. Mephistopheles then begins to answer all the questions. We are by nature, ontologically speaking, we'll get to it when we talk our big five at the end of the lecture, we are by nature creatures of curiosity and wonder. We want to know things. Mephistopheles is able to give him all kinds of knowledge about the nature of the world. But, interestingly, Mephistopheles does refuse to answer Faust when he asks him, who made the universe? No, Mephistopheles is going to play a little bit of demure McGee at that point. Of course, this refusal will prompt yet another series of misgivings for Faust. In other words, Mephistopheles and Lucifer are going to not give the full information. And yet, what they do is they bring in these personifications of the seven deadly sins. They kind of walk around in front of Faust. He's impressed enough to quit his doubts. And now that he's got these new powers, he's attended by Mephistopheles, and he begins his quest, his journey, his, can we say, an odyssey, okay? And it's at this point that, unlike Goethe's Faust, we then will have these really kind of random types of experiences. Marlowe ostensibly uses his powers for nothing more than showing off and doing silly kinds of things with it, which is kind of interesting, but this is the story that Marlowe will tell. First, he goes to the Pope's court in Rome. He makes himself invisible. He plays a series of tricks. He disrupts the Pope's banquet. He steals food. He boxes the Pope on the ears, in fact. Then, after this, he travels to the courts of Europe. His fame obviously beginning to grow. Eventually, he's invited to the court of the German Emperor Charles V, who happens to, of course, be the enemy of the Pope, who asks Faust to allow him to see Alexander the Great, the famed, of course, Macedonian ruler and warrior and conqueror. By the way, this is fascinating. The number of times in stories, we'll think about Swift's Gulliver's Travels in a while, at the end of 3B. But think about it now, that, remember, Swift plays a similar kind of game where you bring people back from history, and one is always Alexander the Great, right? A knight is going to make fun of Faust. This is always a dangerous, right, for a magician to be made fun of. And Faustus will, make antlers sprout from his head. We think about Shakespeare's turning bottom into the head of a donkey and an ass in Midsummer Night's Dream. Of course, the knight's going to vow revenge. Meanwhile, breaking away, we've got Robin. This is Wagner's clown, has picked up some magic on his own, and with his fellow stable hand Ruff, he undergoes a number of comic misadventures that we won't get into. And at one point, he manages to summon Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles threatens to turn Robin and Rafe into animals, or transform them in some way, or punish them for their foolishness. We think of Ovid's Metamorphosis at this point. Faustus then goes on with his travels. He plays a trick on the horse courser along the way. Faust sells him a horse that turns into a heap of straw when it's ridden into the river. Eventually, though, Faustus is invited to the court of Duke of Anhalt, where he performs these amazing feats. Okay, a horse courser shows up there along with Robin and various others who fall victim to Faustus's trickery. In other words, he's kind of seen as almost like Robin Goodfellow or Puck in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, to just like to create problems or whatever. Faustus will cast spells on people and of course amuse the Duke and the Duchess. All right, now the end of the story. We're at 24 years, or we're coming up on it, right? The deal with Lucifer now is ready to come to its penultimate end. Faust, of course, begins to dread the impending death. This will be one of the ironies of all ironies, right? I mean, as we have said, you were learning it when you were a child swinging at the park. I don't want to go to the van. You gotta go to the van, honey. Nobody gets to stay at the park and swing forever. There's power in that word picture. You ain't met no 200-year-old people. And that is an absolute certain fact in a world of not very many absolutes. That's one of them. And because that's the case, everybody's got to go to the van. And yet, ironically, we think of it here. We think of it in our Scrooge story. We think of it in The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Tolstoy's great novella, and a number of other titles. When it finally arrives, it's almost like a straight, oh yeah, my 24 years is almost up, and then I got a crank. Interestingly. Now, of course, he'll begin to ask for some kind of help. The first thing, interestingly, that he has Mephistopheles do is to bring Helen of Troy back. Of course, the beautiful woman who supposedly started all of the craziness in the beginning, right? And he uses Helen of Troy to kind of, impress scholars and the like, right? An old man tries to give Faustus some wisdom and, tell him to repent. But, Faustus is not yet quite ready to hear it. He will summon Helen again. He, of course, will just be blown away by her beauty. Put it in your notes at 3A. We're going to see this same thing happening in Good as Faust Part 2, all right? This notion that the eternal feminine leads us aloft is the last line of Faust, Good as Faust. And we're going to hear this notion of the power of a beautiful woman, and by extension, love, we might say, right? Time now is starting to come to its penultimate end. Faustus will tell the scholars about his pact. They obviously can't believe it, and they resolve to begin to pray for him as if that's somehow going to help him. Now we're to the final night, right? The expiration of the 24 years has now come. It's time. Faustus is overcome. No shock here by fear and a whole lot of remorse. Oh my gosh, what was I thinking? We have said in our Socrates lectures of Plato's Republic that Socrates had that insight that at the moment of death, everybody whispers the same words. The words are, oh my God. The question is the inflection of the voice. And for most humans, certainly Faustus plays this game well, Most humans will come to the final moment of their life and say, oh my God, what have I done with my life? And the inflection of their voice is, oh no, right? There are a few people, and certainly, of course, Socrates in Plato's Apology is suggesting that this can be done. There are a few people who live their life in such a way that when the moment of their death comes, they welcome it. And they say, oh my God, but the tone of their voice, the tone of their words, the intentionality in their voice, the recognition, yep, this had to happen. I knew the van was always waiting for me while I was swinging at the park, and they're ready to go. And so the inflection in their voice when they say, oh my God, is a little bit different, right? Not for Faustus. He begs, no shock here, he begs for mercy, but of course it's too late. At midnight, we got a host of devils that carry off his soul and tear his body to shreds. Scholars find his limbs the next day, and they hold a funeral for him, and that's the end of the story, right? That's how it ends. Now, put this in your notes right away. We'll look at Goethe's Faust to just point out the differences between the endings of the two stories. Let's just put it out, let's say it out loud, we'll come back to it again, but Goethe is going to see Faust as somebody capable of redemption, not Marlowe. For Marlowe, you made your choice, you live with your choice. Now we call them our big five in AP, epistemology, ontology, psychology, sociology, and theodicy. What does this text have to say about each of those? Let's go through them quickly and define each as we go one more time. Epistemology, epistis, knowledge, over relating to the study of knowledge. What can we know? Well, this text says, you know, this is a really interesting one. You got to be careful with what you desire to know. And ultimately, it seems like humans know bloody little, right? The absolutist position, well, Faustus is not ever absolutely certain about much of anything. The fallibilist position, as we've defined it epistemologically, says, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. That's that humility thing, and that's important. Also, epistemologically, this text suggests that you can know, but there's knowledge and then there's doing, right? I mean, Faustus has to know that the 24 years are going to come to an end. You know, but finally when he gets there, he's like, oh yeah, I guess I knew that, I just didn't know that, if you get my drift. Ontologically, that is to say, who are we? Well, this text says, you know who we are? We're creatures that are very curious. We think of Eve in Milton's Paradise Lost,